Okay, so this is SAR for newbies. And let's see if I can get this here. So search and rescue is a place that people with an interest in wilderness medicine tend to gravitate to. And a lot of search and rescue in North America is done by volunteers. And I've spent a lot of my life being a search and rescue volunteer. This presentation is aimed at people that have an interest but maybe not experienced in the search and rescue field. I want to talk about the organization of SAR, the realities of what being a SAR volunteer is like, and touch on personal safety and introduce the concept of operational risk management. You just heard about my background. I've been doing this for a long time, and I have a perspective of somebody that's been at it since a teenager. I've seen things change, but there are a lot of things that have really remained the same. Search and rescue, to define it, is the act of searching for a lost person, rescuing somebody that is in distress or injured. We also recover human remains, do evidence searches on occasion. Classically, search and rescue is an activity that is thought of as being occurring in a wilderness or a maritime setting. There are other variations of search and rescue. Nowadays, we're oftentimes out looking for lost elderly people in suburban settings. And there's a discipline called urban search and rescue, or USAR. And I wanted to just touch on that briefly because I had a unique experience there. Anybody have an idea of what this might be? What's that? That's correct. This is a 2014 Oso landslide. So one morning in 2014, a hillside in northern Snohomish County collapsed. It buried about a square mile, including 49 houses, and killed 43 people. I happened to be with Skagit EMS at that time and responded to Oso. I got there about 2 hours after the initial dispatch, and by that time the last injured person was going away. And a lot of those people were leaving in helicopters. The Snow County Search and Rescue helicopter happened to be in the area training, and so they had an amazingly quick response time. So after the first couple hours, though, there was an urban search and rescue effort that, if memory serves me correctly, lasted for weeks. And I actually spent a day out there also, where, as you can see, they were using heavy equipment to sift through this huge debris field. And there'd be a front-end loader or a shovel load come up, and we would go through that looking for human remains. And over the course of a few weeks, every one of the 43 people that died in that slide was recovered. So urban search and rescue isn't something I'm going to be talking about much more, but that's also something that's out there, typically disaster response. So who's doing SAR in North America? There are a lot of professionals doing search and rescue. Professionals that do it include firefighters, law enforcement, National Park Service people, and professional ski patrol. The military has a pretty significant search and rescue component. A lot of that is oriented towards combat search and rescue, so not necessarily happening in North America, but people that train and have resources. And a lot of the helicopters, a lot of the rotary wing resources that are used in North America for search and rescue are military ships. And then finally, what we're going to be talking about today, people that work as volunteers. And the Mountain Rescue Association has teams throughout North America. There are a variety of other ground teams out there and other kinds of specialty teams. So up front, the realities of being a volunteer in search and rescue. I'm a doctor, but I spend most of my time in search and rescue crashing around in the brush in the rain. There's not a lot of medical treatment that happens. The glamorous stuff, where somebody comes in the helicopter, gets lowered down, does a nice rescue, gets picked back up, and heads home and is home for dinner, stuff that Miles does, isn't really what I do. So the rotary wing dependent stuff, those events have to happen in good weather. When the weather's bad and the helicopters can't fly, they call ground SAR. When it's dark and the helicopters can't fly, they call ground SAR. When you're searching for somebody and air search is presumed to not be effective because you're in the Pacific Northwest and there's a lot of big trees there, it's called ground SAR. When you know that you're recovering a body and therefore there's no urgency, there's no life threat, and the military isn't going to deploy their helicopter for that, we go out. So we go places where no sane person would choose to go. We go there in shitty weather, in the dark. We carry extra stuff while we're doing it, and frequently we're carrying somebody in a litter or somebody in a body bag. We set aside our personal lives and the jobs that generate income to do this. The people that do it, the groups, Mountain Rescue Association, I'd say that's probably the gold standard for volunteer SAR in North America. When I started in 1976, I was a teenager. As well as joining the Mountain Rescue Team, I joined the Explorer Search and Rescue, which is sort of a Boy Scout affiliated thing that does non-technical ground SAR. There are a variety excuse me, of other non-technical ground teams out there. There are also mechanized teams, people using 4x4s, four-wheelers, and snowmobiles. There are cave, swiftwater, and maritime teams, so other specialties. And then finally there are support organizations that don't go out into the field. How are we organized? Well, by law, pretty much everywhere, there is an organization in the government that is tasked with being responsible for search and rescue. In the United States, outside of the national parks, that's typically the county sheriff. So the sheriff has jurisdiction over the event. So the sheriff's department is the agency that's really responsible for doing it, and as a volunteer, we work under the authority of that agency. In national parks, typically the Park Service actually has jurisdiction over the event, and a lot of times now, the Park Service tends to do it on their own, although they do, for big events, still bring in volunteers. Working under the authority of the agency, we typically use the incident command system, and generally the agency rep is the incident commander. And we'll talk more about that later. In Washington State, I have liability coverage working on a search and rescue event from the state of Washington. In Washington State, I also have insurance for damaged equipment and insurance for injury while I'm on an event from the state. There are defined processes for sharing resources between jurisdictions. So in Washington State, as a member of an MRI team, I will frequently go elsewhere in the state. I've been down to Mount Vernon several times, been over to Olympic National Park. We go around, but that happens in a defined process. I work with both Skagit and Bellingham Mountain Rescue. My Skagit County team is pretty small. And if we need more people, as we frequently do, I can't just call up my buddies in Bellingham and say, hey, come on down. I have to go through the incident commander, who goes through the state, who goes through the sheriff in Whatcom County, and all of those administrative boxes have to be checked off before the team from Bellingham can deploy down to Skagit County. Now, obviously, there's a parallel process going on when I'm calling my friends in Whatcom County. Say, hey, we're going to need some help here. And that speeds the process along, but it's really important that we jump through the administrative hoops. As a medical professional and volunteer SAR, first of all, most of the stuff that we encounter in the field is pretty simple. And a lot of times, for me, as somebody who's experienced and been doing this for a long time, I'm involved with something else besides simple patient care. And sometimes I consciously delegate that to somebody else because I know there's somebody that is really enthusiastic. It's like, oh boy, I get to splint an ankle. So it's like, yeah, do that, have fun. And you know, it really is, it's good for people. They get to use their training. So oftentimes I'm standing back and watching unless I really need to be involved. Another way to be involved as a medical professional in search and rescue is training the responders. Teams are intensely grateful for having a medical professional come in and share their knowledge. And by the way, training a team is something that happens on a scheduled basis. So I know I'm not going to miss work. And I know it's going to be okay with my wife if I go do this thing that's scheduled ahead of time, as opposed to just disappearing without any warning. It's possible at times to interface as a medical advisor, if the team has that role. And if you establish with a team, I think it's important to study your own situation with regard to liability involved in patient care. In Washington State, with my MRA teams, I figure that I'm generally doing stuff that's pretty simple. I'm covered by Washington State for liability, and I just assume that that extends to patient care. I haven't actually asked them for a letter. With the Park Service, I have a written agreement that explicitly defines that I'm covered for liability. The other thing is to define your role, define your interaction with the EMS service. Is your team a part of that, or as is more typical, I think, in North America, are ground SAR teams sort of semi-related to EMS, and we do simple patient care in the field, and then as soon as we get out of the field, we hand them off. And where are you in that spectrum, and you know, are you going to be expected to operate under protocols, or are you operating sort of independently and then passing people off? There are typically requirements for volunteers. You're going to have to pass a background check. I'm assuming most of the people in this room would probably do okay with that. You need to register with the state and county, at least in my state, and I'm assuming that's probably pretty universal. The training and experience requirements will vary with the team. And sometimes now, there's a fairly significant time commitment at the front end where they want you to complete a defined course or take several particular individual courses before they'll let you go out into the field. Some of these, in my opinion, are burdensome. And they're not particularly relevant to what you're going to be doing in the field as a SAR volunteer. But they're hoops, and you're going to have to jump through the hoops. Some teams are pretty selective with recruitment. Other teams, like for instance where I'm at in Skagit County, you know, if you've got a little climbing experience and a pulse, we'll probably take you. How are SAR missions initiated? Well, phone or satellite messenger comes into a dispatch center, and that might be the county dispatch center, or it might be one of the other nationwide dispatch centers that are associated with the satellite messengers. The dispatch center then contacts the responsible agency, and the responsible agency is going to determine what resources that they want to deploy. So they'll consider local volunteer teams, they'll consider paid responders. So this is kind of problematic. I live within 5 miles of the local climbing crag. And we've got a fair number of members from Mountain Rescue that live pretty close to the local climbing crag. When somebody gets hurt on Mount Erie, the local climbing crag, they call 911. And when 911 gets called with a climbing accident on Mount Erie, they call the fire department. And, you know, that's how it is. And the fire department does it. Sometimes they'll call the helicopter. But in general, the mountain rescue team for that county, in my county at least, oftentimes is left out of that loop. So there are paid responders that will respond, and then outside resources such as a military helicopter are sometimes requested. So that's just sort of a brief discussion of how things are initiated. I mentioned the incident command system. And I think if you're interested in SAR, it's probably at least having an idea of what that is. It's a standardized approach to pretty much any kind of incident. It's called all hazards. And SAR operations fall under that. It grew out of wildfire management in the West, where these events got really big, and they needed a way to handle it. And there's some advantages to it. It provides common terminology for roles within the command structure. It defines roles within that structure and fills them just as needed. And it provides for a single commander, the incident commander for the incident, which is really useful. Under ICS, the principle is that the most qualified person should be the incident commander. Well, in the Western United States, since the sheriff's office is the agency with jurisdiction, in general, the guy with the badge is most qualified. You know, so some of us who've been doing this for decades, we work with them and we work, you know, under their supervision, and I'm actually happy to have that because that puts, you know, a whole layer of administrative stuff out of my worry. There are defined lines of supervision, and each person is supposed to have one supervisor. Excuse me. It recognizes the idea of span of control, which ideally is about 7, which means that you should really only be supervising about 7 people. And if you go much beyond that, you're not really knowing what's going on. All of this might not feel highly relevant to the average ground search and rescue volunteer. But I would actually be suspicious of any event and organization at this point that's not using an ICS structure for command, just because it has become the standard. And I think there are good reasons for that. So, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how this all goes down with the helicopters. I think that the helicopter is such a great tool. We just expect it's going to happen. We expect, you know, if you call 911 with a SAR event, there's going to be a helicopter coming, and a lot of times that's accurate. Sometimes, a lot of times, the helicopter goes off with a crew on it, and they handle it. There are other situations where they work in coordination with ground resources. Sometimes they're used for searching, and sometimes they're used to insert and extract rescuers or searchers in a situation where you're going to be spending a lot of time. And I'm going to go through now, in my little area, there are 4 primary resources that we use for helicopters. The first one is the Search and Rescue Squadron at the Naval Air Station Whidbey. They've been involved in search and rescue in my community longer than I have. I can remember that because one of my first missions involved them. Their primary mission is to support Navy flight operations. And what that means is, if they have 1 helicopter and 1 crew available, and there are flight operations for the base scheduled, they're not available for us. Because their primary mission is to support the naval flight operation. Now, having said that, in terms of what they actually do, it's civilian search and rescue. They do a lot more civilian search and rescue. It's been a long time since the plane from Whidbey Island crashed. And then, you know, when the last one that did crash, I think they might have gone out there and flown around for a while, but there really wasn't much to do. So these guys are really active in Western Washington and Central Washington in search and rescue. They're really good at what they do. They mainly operate with a winch system. They typically don't like to land, although they do. And unlike a lot of our other resources, they're perfectly comfortable flying at night. One thing about them, though, is they don't do body recoveries. Now, sometimes that gets a little bit, you know, a little bit squishy. If they get to them and they're still warm, they might not be dead yet. So, you know, that has helped us out a couple times. But in general, if it's a body recovery, they're not going. The Snohomish County Search and Rescue Helicopter, the one that Miles works on, is an interesting model with volunteer staffing and working under the Sheriff's Office. They will search and insert. They have a winch capability. I've worked with them lots, and they're great to work with. The National Park Service at North Cascades has a contract helicopter during the season. So most of the year they actually don't have a contract SAR helicopter. The current system that they have right now is that the contract helicopter for search and rescue with the national parks is shared between Mount Rainier and North Cascades. They're primarily short haul and landing oriented. They have no winch capability. They're daylight only. And generally, if they're going to be used, it's going to be in the park or very close to the park. Now, the last resource that we have available is Customs and Border Protection. Since we're right on the border, these guys have a lot of money and a lot of toys, and they're looking for things to do with them. So they have a Black Hawk, which you see here. They also have an A-Star, which is a little small 5-seat helicopter that they actually let me fly one time. That was pretty cool. They have to land. They don't have any external load capabilities, at least none that they'll use with us. They will search and they will insert people, and for us, at least, they're a daylight-only operation. Now, one of the reasons I went through all of these 4 different resources is to point out that for much of North America, like my home region, there is no dedicated civilian search and rescue helicopter resource. We have to go begging. Now, granted, most of the time the resource are pretty eager to help us. But I have run into situations where there really isn't anything available, so also, you know, requesting things through channels is time-consuming sometimes. So helicopter issues, they're great tools. We all love helicopters. I love flying around in helicopters. But they're also by far the most common reason for people in search and rescue to die. And when things go wrong with a helicopter, my observation is they go very wrong. And oftentimes there's lots of people on that ship when things go very wrong. So we'll talk more about this later, but you got to think about the risk there. Another thing with helicopters is that when they're in the immediate vicinity, when they are overhead, or when they're taking off and landing, they bring chaos. Oftentimes, especially where I'm at, where we're not dealing with a dedicated SAR resource, we may not have radio communications with that ship. I think that's unbelievable in 2020, but that's the truth of it. We may not have radio communications with a ship directly above us. You may not have verbal communications with the person next to you. If it's a Black Hawk, the winds are going to be approximating a hurricane, and everybody is super amped up because they're the helicopter, woo! So that phase of the operation always makes me distinctly uncomfortable. They're easy and they're fast, and they become the default. And I've seen stuff like winch operations being undertaken with the patient beside a ground ambulance, a quarter mile from a landing zone. I've seen winch operations from a helicopter beside the road with a perfectly competent ground technical rescue team standing there. And I'm distinctly uncomfortable with that. I think that, there's we're not thinking about risk and benefit there. Another thing with helicopters is that they're mechanical. They break down, they run out of fuel, and in the North Cascades, you can't fly a helicopter in the clouds because the clouds have rocks in them. So, if I get flown out to someplace in a helicopter, I never assume I'm getting a ride back. I'm always ready to spend the night there or walk out. And just because the helicopter is going, I don't assume the helicopter is going to complete the mission. Now that's kind of irritating, because what that leads to is a lot of times guys like me interrupt our day to get a pack together and be ready to go on a mission that I know I have about a 5% chance of actually having to go on. And that's a strain and a stress on the volunteers, and it's irritating. So, moving over from helicopters to hazards in SAR, missions take place in hazardous environments frequently, and we're doing stuff like flying helicopters around the mountains and hanging people off of cliffs on ropes. Since 4 years after I started, since 1980, in my little corner of the world, Skagit and Whatcom counties, western Washington, less than 250,000 people population total, 6 people have died doing search and rescue. That's a small community. And most days, we're not out doing stuff. Most days, there isn't SAR activity. So that's a huge rate of loss. 6 people. So it can be risky business. That picture, it's a picture of a plaque. And that plaque sits near Perfect Pass in the North Cascades. It memorializes Firewood 1 from the Whitby SAR Squadron that crashed while trying to rescue a hiker with non-life-threatening injuries. 5 people died. 2 more people were seriously injured. This was 1980. So it's not clear to me that they had good communications to know that the person that they were going to rescue had a non-life-threatening injury. But what I can say is clear to me, even in retrospect, they knew the weather was crappy. They knew the weather was at best marginal. I knew some of the people that died on that ship. More recently, in Skagit County, we had a, it didn't click. I'm going the wrong way, all right. More recently in Skagit County, we had one of our, not Mountain Rescue Association, but a SAR volunteer die in a fall. The situation was that a group of hikers decided they wanted to go to Pilchuck Falls. It was probably, that decision might have been fueled by a little beer. The trail to Pilchuck Falls is not really a maintained trail. It's just a trail that happened. And it traverses a steep clay bank above a cliff. So It was wet and slippery. One of the hikers fell and was not heard from again. Another hiker fell and managed to catch himself on a tree, and so he stuck mid-cliff. There was an ATV team, so guys riding around on four-wheelers, search and rescue team, that happened to be nearby, and they responded to the scene. The most experienced people on the ATV team headed off down that slippery trail, the one that two people had just fell off of. They headed off down that trail to see if they could find the guy that was missing. There were less experienced members that were left on top as it was getting dark. There were some drunk hikers there saying, hey, you got to do something, you got to do something. This guy down at the bottom of the cliff screaming. So probably not a very organized scene up on top of that cliff. One of the ATV members saw a flash of something out of the corner of their eye. They weren't sure what it was, and so they got their people together and counted up, and somebody was missing. So, both the hiker and the SAR member were found dead at the bottom of the cliff. I was getting ready to go at our cache, getting our gear together, when I got the call from one of our people that was already out there. This is not a good situation. One of their people just fell and died. Oh, you mean the hiker? No. One of the SAR people. No, you mean the hiker, right? No, it's one of the SAR people. Unbelievable. So, that night we got there, got the trapped hiker off, and then, stood down for the night because we knew we had a body recovery and that could be done in the daylight. The fact of the matter is we actually had people from Everett come over and help us with the body recovery. So we don't really know how this happened. But what we do know is there was a hazardous location, there was a chaotic scene, the leaders were absent and engaged. They were focused on finding the missing guy as opposed to the big picture of what's going on here and are all my people safe. I kind of ask myself the question sometimes, if this had been a county crew that had gone out there to pick up trash, do you think they would have let one of their people get close enough to that cliff to fall off of? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. And what was the risk-benefit analysis? Probably not one done, but retrospectively, and I realize this is retrospective, I'd say it was all risk and no benefit. So, thinking about risk in search and rescue, the place that I start from is this is not combat SAR. We are not getting shot at. The people out there are the ones with the emergency. And we want to try and help them. But we should all come home every time. And by and large, we shouldn't have people getting hurt on our mission. So this work, when you're doing it, especially if something is really emergent, it's compelling and it's rewarding. Getting shit done is really rewarding on a SAR mission. And we develop the mentality of we're going to rescue somebody, and we get focused on completing the mission. The problem with that is that you lose sight of a thoughtful analysis of risk and benefit, or at least you can. Unless you go back to the idea that everybody should be coming home. And there's a tendency at times, though we try to train regularly, you can't train for every situation. And you may run into a situation where improvising makes sense. And I can think of once or twice where we started down a path of improvisation on a SAR mission. And thank God somebody stepped back and said, yeah, what are the possible consequences here? I mean, they were going to put somebody out on a rope in swift water without proper safety equipment and without something to release them to recover a body. I'm not sure who that somebody was. It might have been me. But somewhere along the line we stopped and said, you know, why are we doing this? We can step back, we can stop, we can figure it out, and we'll solve this problem later. So improvisation in a high consequence situation is something that I really try to avoid. Another thing that we need to acknowledge is that people may not always understand the risks that they're going off into. So it's our job to make sure that the team is aware of the risks that they're being exposed to, and it's also our job to make sure that team members understand that they have the capacity and indeed the responsibility to be actively engaged in looking for risks, and if they see something that concerns them, to bring that forward. So, there's always going to be an element of risk. Another thing to remember, wow, my throat is bad. So, while we're volunteers in search and rescue, we're actually held to professional standards. And what that means, once again, is that we need to be very conscious of when people are exposed to hazards and mitigating appropriately. A SAR operation isn't a private trip. And so while on a private trip you might say, well, I'll just scramble up and out of that thing and get to that anchor, and you feel perfectly comfortable doing that. The fact of the matter is, if you look at that situation and say, well, yeah, but you're out there exposed to a significant fall hazard. On a SAR operation, you know, you're really not taking a personal risk, you're taking an organizational risk. So, acceptance of risk for a SAR volunteer is necessary sometimes. You say, yeah, I understand, there might be a hazard here. But it's not sufficient. The incident commander should be aware of and authorize activities that involve significant risk to the person on a SAR mission. Team members, once again, should be aware of things that are potential hazards. Nobody should be expected or pressured to accept a risk that they are not comfortable with. And every team member should be engaged in assessing the risk of the situation at any given moment. This is a summary of a tool that we use to assess risk, and I don't know if I like the term or not, it's SAR-GAR. And the GAR stands for green, amber, red. And basically what we do at the beginning of an operation, after a team has been assigned a task, we go through our assignment and consider the supervision, the complexity of the assignment, the fitness of the team, the environment and the hazards present in the environment, the team itself, and then whether we're working with improvisation or something that's planned. And each team member assigns green, which is like, yeah, that's cool. Amber, like, I have some concerns, or red, yeah, that's a little risky. And anytime one member of a team has an amber or a red, that team is an amber or red. And anything that's amber or red, we should be considering what can we do to mitigate the risk. And in situations where you have a red that you really can't mitigate on your team assignment, then we need to loop back through with incident command and say, hey, we have some concerns about this. There could be a problem, and there needs to be a risk-benefit evaluation that really happens at the command level with input from the team. So that's just a brief introduction to the concept of operational risk management. And another thing about this is, any time during the mission when things change, you really should pause and say, okay, let's look at the situation now in light of the new information that we have. So I want to talk about psychological risks. This is back at OSO. This is the day of the slide. This picture wasn't taken there, but it's the picture that I have of that place. And when I was there was no hole in this house. The day of the slide, all the injured people had been evacuated within the first couple hours, and after that, because there were concerns about additional slides and flooding from the river that had been dammed by the slide, all of the search teams were pulled out of the field. I managed to get assigned to a group that was going back out there just to look things over. And we went back out there to look things over, and some civilians that happened to have made it out there told us that they'd heard signs of life in a demolished house. So we went to this demolished house, and indeed there were signs of life. You could hear a dog. So for the next 3 hours, we had hand tools and a chainsaw. And this is not structural search and rescue. That's not what I do, right? But a few of us with hand tools and a chainsaw were there trying to get the dog. As it started to get dark, command told us we had to leave. That didn't sit well with me. But I understood my role within the organization, so we left. And I was haunted by the idea that I had left this wet-nosed, wag-tailed, four-legged member of somebody's family in this demolished house. Basically, I thought to die. And I struggled with that for a couple of days. And the only reason I stopped struggling is that I learned that when the families had been allowed back in to get their belongings, they'd actually managed to rescue their dog. And so this, lad came out of there sort of, a little worse for the wear, but not bad. He looked fine. So in my career, I've picked up a boot that had a foot in it. I've recovered countless bodies. On one situation, I belayed a couple of young men up to look at the bones of their father, who had been missing for 2 years and was located on a cliff. And on one occasion, halfway through a mission, I realized that the person that we were going out to rescue and weren't going to be able to rescue that day was somebody that I'd climbed with. And later, I had to knock on the door of his house and give his wife the worst possible news. But for some reason, the dog is what stands out in my career as a SAR volunteer as something that really messed me up. And luckily for me, I think, because I don't know how I would feel about it now if there hadn't been a happy ending there. Luckily for me, there was a happy ending here. But a lot of times there's not. If you do this long enough, something's going to get to you. And there's a recognition that we need to address this in SAR volunteers. So one of the things that I suggest is that you understand your own limitations. There are some people that I work with that really don't like to get involved with body recoveries. At least they don't like to get involved with the packaging part of that. I'm pretty confident now that generally it's not going to bother me. So I make sure that the people that are going to be bothered by it aren't exposed to it. If it does happen, then I encourage people to address it, to talk about it, see a therapist, do whatever you need to do. And, there's an effort in the organization to address this as SAR volunteers. So repetition. Helicopters are great tools but they're also, by far, the biggest exposure to risk. Don't get carried away, don't get impatient, don't improvise when there are high consequences. Don't blindly trust your leaders to keep you and your teammates safe. If you see something out there that doesn't seem right, if you have an uncomfortable feeling, speak up. And I think this goes for not just missions, but private trips too. When you're out there, don't fall into groupthink and don't endorse the expert halo. Have you guys, anybody read the article about the Tunnel Creek slide? It's a great article. It's about an avalanche that happened in Stevens Pass years ago. And a group of skiers went out. They were in some pretty risky conditions. And a whole bunch of the survivors talked later about how they recognized they were in a dangerous spot. But they were following people that knew the area and were really good skiers, so they didn't say anything. So don't remain silent if something concerns you. Now, why do this? I've been doing this for over 40 years, and I think it's a universal human impulse to bring people home. If somebody is lost, somebody is hurt, if somebody's dead, I want to bring them home. People that play in the wilderness are my tribe. And when a member of my tribe needs to come home, I'll bring them home. It takes a certain kind of person to go out in the cold, the dark, the rain, to grovel through brush, to swim in sloppy snow, to bring someone home. And I savor the time that I get to spend with these people. I really like the people I work with in SAR. Also, practicing medicine in the wilderness, it's a special kind of medicine. Your toolbox is a lot smaller. The problems are so much cleaner than what I experience in the emergency department in the community. And in wilderness medicine, I never have to discharge somebody to the street. And I do that all the time. It's a very good job. So if you're interested to get involved, local teams oftentimes will have an online presence where you can find where their meeting dates are or contact information. And if you can't find that, your local sheriff's office or emergency management should be able to put you in touch. If you go to get involved, be patient and be humble. Be patient because the people that are dealing with your paperwork are likely volunteers, so things might not turn around really quickly. There are going to be lots of hoops to jump through, and a lot of those won't make much sense, but that is the nature of the beast in these days. Once you have a foot in the door, make time to be visible at trainings, and if you find people in trainings that you like, get out with them on private trips. And then finally, as a medical professional, look for opportunities to teach. A couple other details. First of all, set limits if you're going to do this. This is a volunteer gig, and sometimes you have to say no. Any time that I miss a shift to go on a mission, first of all, I'm taking a financial hit, and that matters to me. Secondly, I'm asking my partners to step up. And so I'm selective about when I do that. If you acquire a merit badge or a training certificate, save it. Put all that stuff in a folder or take a picture of it, put it in a file, but save it because you never know when you're going to need it. Bring your own communications. I'm married to a kind of anxious person, and she really loves hearing from me by text occasionally from that inReach device. Yeah, everything's okay. And that goes a long way to smooth over, like, yeah, I'm taking off and I'm going on a SAR. So, yeah, I'll be in touch. Okay, you're not going to have to stew when you're worried. And then, in my daily life, probably the most dangerous thing I do on a routine basis is driving home from an ED shift at 4 a.m. And if it finally gets me, they're going to wonder why the windows were down at 5 in the morning on a dark, rainy Washington day. It's because the windows are down and I'm singing out loud trying to stay awake. So, if you go on SAR missions, it's a good idea to be set up to take a nap before you travel home. So warm, comfortable clothes, maybe a little food, some way to get some rest if you're too tired to drive. Because SAR volunteers have been killed on the road driving home from mission. It happens. So I hope that this talk gives you a little bit of understanding, at least what I think being a SAR volunteer is like. And I hope maybe a few of you are more interested. It's not what most people would really consider fun. But I don't actually think that most of the people in this room are vacationing at Disneyland. So thanks. Question?
I have one quick question about like the logistics of going on a mission.
Okay.
What's generally, say, the turnaround time, or say like as a medical student I don't have a ton of flexibility in my schedule, like
Yeah.
how quickly do you have to be ready to go out on a mission and all of that?
Well, so the question is logistics, turnaround time, how quickly do you have to be ready? I think it's completely variable. A lot of times on searches, for instance, or body recoveries, I know the night before that we're going out tomorrow. Other times, I'm not as fast as I can. I now actually have a set of gear that I keep at the SAR cache. So if I get a call, I don't have to go home, I don't have to put together a pack, I just go. So it's completely variable. And it can take anywhere from 2 or 3 hours for something pretty quick and simple to, I've gone out for something, it's like, yeah, we're going to get this done tonight. And no, we're not going to get it done tonight. And I'm, having dispatch call the emergency department and tell them that I'm not going to be in for work in the morning. That, oh, okay, next question, anybody? Oh, yes.
Talk a little more specifically about what your role is as a new member on SAR, like if we were going to join, and then how your role changed as you become more experienced physician member.
Yeah, sure. Well, so starting as a new member, and then the change in the role. As a new member, first of all, typically you're going to have to complete some level of training and some part of an onboarding process, which might be pretty informal. It might be pretty formal and pretty extensive. After that, you can expect to be fairly closely supervised for a while, and then gradually have expanding responsibilities. That's the optimal way. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's typically what I would expect. And the medical responsibilities will vary. And, there's a progression kind of from member of a team to leader of a team to maybe somebody being sort of the person directing the operation. And that can take a long time, or sometimes, people just find a niche that they're happy in and they stay in that role.
We have to cut it off there just to get ready for the next speaker.
All right, thank
if
you.
you guys could all join me in thanking Dr. Slack for his time.